Hi, in this video I'm going to be talking about things that I like and things that I don't like about cassettes. Now, as I've mentioned in many videos in the past, there really seems to be a resurgence in interest when it comes to cassettes. Certainly a lot of people out there seem to be interested in cassettes, a lot of people collect them, a lot of people sell them on various internet sites like eBay. My relationship with cassettes started many years ago. I grew up in the 80s, and of course back in the 80s, cassettes were the dominant form, at least until compact disc came along. And I remember collecting cassettes with great enthusiasm. I enjoyed nothing more than buying the latest tape by my favorite band or singer. And to this day, there's still something very charming about cassettes. There are many things about cassettes that I really like. But to be honest with you, there are things about cassettes that I don't like, and so I'm going to cover both of those in this video. Now, the first thing that I like about cassettes, you can't deny there's just something very retro cool about cassettes, and I think there always will be. I think people who are too young to remember the 80s, or people who just didn't experience the 80s because they were born at a much later time, I think we would all agree that cassettes have that iconic quality about them that immediately takes us back to a bygone age. And certainly for myself, I would agree. For me, I will always associate cassettes with this sort of retro cool quality that I think they will always have. And I think that's a big reason why, to many people, they are still quite collectible. Now, one thing I don't like about cassettes, and I've mentioned this before, in my opinion, they just don't age well. I have many tapes that are 30, 40 years old, and they're just not playable anymore. They will sometimes have that awful cassette shriek, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. When you have an older tape and you try to play it, you can barely hear the music because it has that awful shriek to it. I'm sure you've experienced that. And again, I find this happens more often than not, and this is something about cassettes that really is a drawback for me. I find that they just don't age well. And I've had people say to me, well, if you store cassettes in proper conditions, if you store them, if you make sure they're in a correct temperature and a correct humidity, they will age better. And I don't deny that. But for most intents and purposes, in my opinion, they just don't age well. Certainly not as well as vinyl or compact discs. Another thing I like about cassettes is the rarity. There are some tapes out there that are very rare, very obscure, cassettes that have still not been released digitally and probably never will be. So other than finding that particular release on vinyl, your next best bet is to find it on cassette. And it's really exciting when you find that elusive recording that you've been trying to find for years. When you finally get your hands on a copy on cassette, that can be a very exciting feeling. One thing about cassettes that I consider a drawback is the sound quality. In my opinion, it just goes without saying that digital is a much cleaner, more pristine version of the recording. Now, I've had all kinds of people say things to me like, well, if you play a well-preserved cassette on a really high-end tape player like an Onkyo or something like that, it sounds just as good as a CD. I don't deny that. The problem is, a lot of us never could afford a high-end deck like an Onkyo, and probably never could. So to me, that's really not being very realistic. I could never afford such high-end equipment, and I probably never will. So for most people, for most punters like myself who are just sort of casual fans who love to listen to music, we're probably never going to have access to such a high-end piece of equipment. And to me, the sound quality just isn't there. One thing I do enjoy about cassettes is sealed blank cassettes. And this can be a lot of fun. It's really interesting when you're in a second-hand shop and you come across some sealed blank cassettes. That's a really fun thing, and it's a very exciting thing, which I'm sure many of you would agree with. Now, some people take these sealed blank cassettes and resell them on the internet, and you can make quite a hefty profit off that. I'm not really into that myself, but hey, if that's your thing, go for it. But for myself personally, I just find it kind of fun to collect these very rare sealed blank cassettes. Another thing I really don't like about cassettes is they can be very clunky and very bulky and kind of hard to store. Now, many of you might say, well, cassettes are certainly a lot smaller than vinyl. They take up a lot less room than vinyl. I kind of see your point, but on the same token, I feel with cassettes you have to have storage units. You have to have those special shelving storage units that you can attach to the wall, whether it be a wooden one or a steel rack or a plastic one. I find with cassettes you kind of need those storage units. Now, I've tried to store cassettes in stacks, and I find there's nothing more annoying than when a stack of cassettes topples over. I find with vinyl, and to a lesser degree with CDs, you can kind of store them neatly on a shelf, and there's not a whole lot of risk of them falling or toppling over. With cassettes, that's not the case. And again, there's nothing really more annoying than a stack of cassettes falling over. We all know that sound. We all know how heartbreaking that can be. And again, I just kind of find cassettes kind of clunky and cumbersome, and they just take up a lot of space. One thing I do like about cassettes, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is what I call the thrill of the hunt. Now, again, as I've mentioned before, I am a collector. I love to collect music in all its forms. I collect cassettes, vinyl, CDs, even 8-tracks and things like that. And again, as I said, it's really exciting when you have the thrill of the hunt and when you can find that elusive cassette that you've been looking for years and years, and you finally find a copy in a secondhand store or online. It's a really great feeling, and I find that a lot of fun. One thing I find that is a real hassle about cassettes is they can be a real pain to repair, and I'm sure you can all relate to this. If you have a cassette that snaps, of course you can always break the shell apart or take it apart and splice that broken tape. And some of us are better at that than others. Now, of course, as I've mentioned in previous videos, if you happen to have a cassette shell that doesn't have screws and it's kind of sealed together and you have to break it open, that can be a whole other story altogether, and that can be quite challenging. And again, from my experience, some cassettes are very easy to repair and to fix, but in some cases it can be darn near impossible and a real headache. So for that reason, I find cassettes can be a real hassle to repair. One thing I enjoy about cassettes, and this is kind of a hobby of mine, is that I enjoy digitizing old cassettes. And I especially enjoy digitizing homemade cassettes that I made years ago, especially from my childhood. Not that long ago, I recently found a bunch of cassettes that I made in my childhood, and a lot of these were sort of some of the first mixes I ever made. They were songs that I recorded off the radio, and sometimes I was fortunate enough to find recordings of my own voice that I made when I was a child. And I totally love and enjoy digitizing these priceless recordings. I find that a lot of fun, and I actually consider that a hobby, and it's a hobby that I really enjoy doing. And the last thing I really don't like about cassettes is jewel cases. What issue do I have with jewel cases? Well, quite simply, jewel cases break, and they crack, and they snap very, very easily. And of course, you can say the same thing about CDs, but I find it is especially true with cassettes. I just find it simply annoying that if you ever want to ship a cassette in the mail, and certainly I did a lot of this back in the day, even if you put a cassette in a very hefty, sturdy bubble envelope, I can almost guarantee you by the time it gets to its destination, the jewel case will have at least one crack in it. I find that really frustrating and really annoying. Now, I'm sure many of you will say, well, just change the jewel case, get a new jewel case, replace it. That's true, but again, to me, that is kind of a hassle. And especially if it's a cassette that's not very valuable. Certainly if it's a cassette that is rare and is valuable, I'll more than gladly change the jewel case and buy a new jewel case for it. But if it's just some cassette that I bought for 25 cents at a flea market or a yard sale, I can't be bothered giving that tape a new jewel case. That's really a hassle. So, those are some reasons why I like and why I don't like cassettes. And certainly if you agree with my reasons, that's great. And if you don't agree with them, that's great as well. And certainly I would love to hear from you. So if you have your own reasons why you like or dislike cassettes, please leave a comment. Give us a thumbs up, and as always, subscribe to the channel. I post new tech reviews every week and would love to have you join our family. Thanks again. We'll see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.